Right, Debbie, time is 12 minutes past 9. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder. You don't have anything for the Mayhem defence. Don't mention one question, something for later on.
What do you mean? I'm
anything you do say, no, give me
murder.
evidence.
What do you mean? I'm in suspicion?
Right, just stay sat there.
What do you mean?
In a quiet neighborhood in Bournemouth, England, life moved at an ordinary pace. Children played outside, neighbors exchanged pleasantries, and the days passed without incident. But behind the modest walls of a flat on Rosemount Road, a horror story was slowly brewing, one that no one could have predicted. Simon Shotton was a familiar figure in the area, though not always for the right reasons. Known to some as a kind man with a rough past and to others as a drifter with addiction struggles, Simon often teetered on the edge of society. His world was unstable, but he wasn't violent. He was, by most accounts, vulnerable, which is why it shocked so many when he ended up at the center of one of Dorset's most disturbing murder cases. In the months leading up to his death, Simon had been allowed to stay in a tent in the garden of Benjamin Atkins and Debbie Pereira's flat. It wasn't charity so much as an arrangement, unofficial and undefined. Maybe Benjamin saw him as useful, or maybe it was just a temporary favor. Whatever the reason, Simon had become part of the household, albeit from the outside. And then, without warning, he vanished. Welcome to Crime Uncovered, where every case has a story, and the truth is often stranger and darker than fiction. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button to stay updated on the latest true crime cases we uncover. And to our returning subscribers, thank you for your continued support. Don't forget to like this video so it reaches more people who care about the truth behind the headlines. So back to our story. For weeks, people began asking questions. Where had Simon gone? He had no phone, no bank account, and he wasn't the kind of man who disappeared without someone noticing. But Benjamin and Debbie had a simple answer: Simon had left. Walked away. No fuss, no goodbye. Just gone. They even offered stories to back it up. He'd fallen out with them, or he'd taken off for work. It was a lie they clung to, until a smell began creeping from the garden. It started with an odor. At first, it was faint. Just a strange smell hanging in the summer air. Something unpleasant but hard to place. But over the days, it grew stronger, more invasive. It clung to the back of throats, filled lungs with a sickening weight. Neighbors began to complain, and even Debbie Pereira found it impossible to ignore. She claimed it was coming from a pile of rubbish in the garden. But deep down, she likely knew the truth. Because that stench wasn't rot from trash or animal waste. It was the unmistakable scent of death. Debbie called pest control, hoping to mask her growing panic with a show of normalcy. Meanwhile, Benjamin Atkins was becoming increasingly agitated, restless, and unpredictable. Something was rotting not just in the garden but in his conscience. Eventually, the situation could no longer be ignored. A pest control worker arrived to assess the supposed garbage heap, but instead of rats or mold, he made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the community. Beneath a mound of soil and tangled undergrowth, hidden under a disused mattress and carpet, was a human body, wrapped in a tarpaulin, burned and decomposing beyond recognition. It was a gruesome, unforgettable scene. Charred limbs poked through the plastic. Flies swarmed the air, and the smell was unbearable. Police were immediately summoned. The garden that once served as a shelter had become a makeshift graveyard. The remains were so badly burned that identification wasn't immediate. But investigators had a suspicion, and it didn't take long to confirm. The body was that of Simon Shotton. Before the horror, Simon Shotton was a man trying to survive on the edges of society. Born in 1987, he'd led a life marked by hardship. A history of addiction and mental health issues had left him vulnerable and frequently homeless. But those who knew him described him as soft-spoken, a man with demons but not a violent bone in his body. Simon often relied on temporary arrangements for shelter, so staying in a tent in someone's garden wasn't unusual for him. It was just another stop on a long, weary road. But despite his instability, Simon wasn't someone who simply cut ties. His sudden disappearance triggered concern among local support groups and acquaintances. Authorities discovered that Simon had stopped showing up to food banks, appointments, and shelters. He hadn't used his benefits, hadn't checked in with anyone. His world had gone silent. Even more troubling, messages from Simon's Facebook account had been sent after his estimated time of death. Posts and comments made it seem like he was still alive, but investigators quickly realized they were a smokescreen. Someone had taken over his online identity to buy time and deflect suspicion. As detectives dug into the timeline, they began to reconstruct Simon's final days. And what emerged was a disturbing portrait of manipulation, brutality, and betrayal. Benjamin Atkins and Debbie Pereira were not strangers to chaos. Their flat on Rosemount Road had become a place of instability, a revolving door of arguments, drug use, and erratic behavior. Neighbors recalled heated rows, shouting at odd hours, and strange figures drifting in and out of the home. Debbie had a long-standing heroin addiction, and Benjamin, a man with a violent streak and volatile temper, fed off confrontation. Theirs was a toxic, codependent relationship held together by shared addictions and mutual distrust. At some point in early summer 2023, Simon moved his tent into their garden. He was never invited into the home for long, but he became a fixture, doing odd jobs, sometimes eating with them, often just trying to stay out of the way. But tensions brewed. Simon, dependent on their charity, likely walked on eggshells. And Benjamin, paranoid and controlling, began to see him as a nuisance, even a threat. The exact trigger remains unknown, but what happened next revealed the depths of human cruelty. Simon's death wasn't quick. It wasn't an accident. It was prolonged, deliberate, and sadistic. In a sickening twist, it was discovered that Simon had been subjected to a brutal assault before his death. He was beaten and restrained, his hands bound behind his back with cable ties. His mouth was stuffed with a pair of socks. A makeshift ligature had been tightened around his neck, causing slow, suffocating trauma. The crime scene told a chilling story. A speaker, weighing nearly 40 pounds, had been dropped on Simon's chest repeatedly, perhaps to ensure his ribs shattered or to further incapacitate him. A hairbrush had been used to violate him, suggesting a twisted, humiliating component to the violence. It wasn't just murder. It was degrading. After he died, his body was wrapped in plastic, doused in bleach, and hidden beneath a mattress. Days later, Benjamin attempted to burn the remains in a shallow fire pit, likely hoping to erase evidence, perhaps even identity. But the fire was incomplete. Simon's body was scorched, not destroyed. The horror hadn't ended with death. It lingered in the way his corpse was treated, in the dehumanization, the concealment, the lies that followed. While Simon lay lifeless beneath the dirt, his Facebook account mysteriously remained active. Posts appeared at odd hours. Comments were left on pages he hadn't interacted with in months. At first glance, it seemed like he was still alive, just lying low. But investigators quickly saw through the illusion. Tracing IP addresses revealed that the account was being accessed from within the Pereira-Atkins household. Debbie admitted she had the login credentials, but she claimed Simon had given them to her, a convenient explanation that unraveled under scrutiny. Digital forensics revealed something more sinister. The messages weren't just random. They were designed to make it seem like Simon was still traveling, still in contact with friends. The tone mimicked his, but inconsistently. At times, the posts seemed forced, robotic, like someone struggling to imitate a voice they didn't understand. It became clear that this was part of a larger cover-up. The goal was to delay discovery for as long as possible. The more time passed, the harder it would be to trace the crime back to them. Or so they thought. But they hadn't counted on the smell or the persistence of neighbors. Once the body was discovered, both Debbie Pereira and Benjamin Atkins were arrested. Initially, they told conflicting stories. Debbie claimed she had nothing to do with the murder and portrayed herself as a helpless bystander. Benjamin, on the other hand, remained stone-faced and refused to offer explanations. But the pressure mounted quickly. Forensic evidence was damning. Simon's blood was found on items inside the flat, including the speaker. Bleach-stained clothing linked back to Benjamin. And then there were the text messages, disturbing exchanges between the couple in the days following Simon's death. In one chilling message, Debbie referred to the body with a haunting nickname, the parcel. They joked, even laughed, about moving it. In another, she warned Benjamin not to tell anyone. "Just say he left," she wrote. The tone was callous, detached, as if discussing the disposal of garbage, not a human being. Eventually, faced with overwhelming evidence, Debbie broke down. In a shocking statement to police, she admitted she had witnessed the murder but insisted she was too afraid to intervene. She described watching Benjamin tie Simon up, assault him, and leave him to die. She claimed she had screamed, begged him to stop, but did nothing more. Investigators didn't buy her story completely. The timeline, the Facebook activity, and her casual behavior in the aftermath all pointed to complicity. At trial, Benjamin Atkins pled guilty to murder. His confession was cold, mechanical, delivered without remorse. He admitted to tying Simon up, assaulting him, and ultimately killing him. But he offered no explanation for why. No motive, no justification, just silence. Debbie Pereira was charged with perverting the course of justice and assisting an offender. Though she insisted she hadn't participated in the murder itself, her actions before and after the crime left little room for doubt. She had helped conceal the body, misled police, and maintained the illusion that Simon was still alive. The court heard gruesome details, autopsy reports, forensic findings, testimony from neighbors. Photos of the shallow grave were shown. Gasps rippled through the room. Even seasoned detectives admitted this was one of the most disturbing cases they'd ever encountered. Simon Shotton's sister wept as she addressed the court, describing the pain of losing a brother in such a cruel, dehumanizing way. "He wasn't perfect," she said, "but he was ours." In the end, justice came, but not without a bitter aftertaste. Benjamin Atkins was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 21 years before he would even be eligible for parole. The court found him guilty of murdering Simon Shotton and burying him like he was nothing. Yet even that sentence didn't feel like enough for those who had come to know Simon's story. Debbie Pereira, who had helped conceal the crime, burned Simon's belongings, and lied to cover up the murder, was originally sentenced to 4 years in prison. But her sentence, like Atkins, was reviewed and later increased. She would now serve 6 years, a small measure of accountability for the lies that kept Simon buried in silence for nearly a year. But even as the courtroom doors closed and headlines faded, the unease remained. Simon's murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symptom of a society that failed to see him. A quiet man with no home, no steady place in the world, and no one to notice when he vanished. He drifted through life largely unseen, and in death he almost disappeared without a trace. The garden where he was found has long since been cleared, the soil turned and replanted. But the memory of what happened there still lingers. Neighbors remember the strange smell, the late-night fires, and the chilling silence that followed. Some say they still feel a heaviness when they pass by, like something was permanently broken in that quiet patch of earth. Simon Shotton's story is a haunting reminder, not only of cruelty and betrayal, but of how easily the vulnerable can slip through the cracks, and how, sometimes, it takes almost a year and a determined search to dig the truth out of the dirt. His life ended in violence and isolation, but in the end, the truth did claw its way into the light. Not for justice alone, but so Simon would finally be seen. Thank you for watching. Every victim deserves their story told. If you found this story shocking and heartbreaking, subscribe to Crime Uncovered and help keep their memory alive. What do you think about this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep questioning everything.